This just in, a wild Daily Solutions podcast is broken free from the zoo and is running all throughout the city, causing havoc everywhere it goes. Hopefully they will catch it and restrain it soon. More on that story tonight.
All right. Hey, everyone.
Hey, everyone.
Another day, another podcast. And I'm Graham.
I'm Ashkahn.
Today's question is, love the quick burst of float podcasting. Not a question, but thank you.
Oh,
thank you.
All right.
There is a second part to that, too, which is I was wondering, or if you've heard of any float center out there opening as a nonprofit. We're all about that floaty goodness, but I'm curious if anyone took it further. And if not, what do you think?
I know one.
You do?
From back in the day.
Oh. What?
And so the details are fuzzy though. But I believe that I think Tom Fine, John Turner, and maybe Richard Bonk was part of it, and also Jeffrey Bruno, I think, was maybe a part of it. So back in the day when they were first doing kind of research, float tank research out in Toledo, Ohio, I feel like they told me about the fact that they started kind of a nonprofit float center. And that's it. Those are all the details I know about it. But it was super. I remember being very interested.
Yep, and I mean, in a sense, I guess any float centers that are on a university are sort of like a non-profit float.
I don't know if it was
researcher.
affiliated with the university or anything.
Just their own thing.
I really.
We don't know. You should call Tom Fine, get a little guest appearance on here or something. I don't know of any that are open right now that are actually active nonprofits. Again, other than float tanks in universities or some other setting like that, which
part of like a research facility.
Yeah, it could be considered a nonprofit for sure. But as far as commercial float centers operating as nonprofits, just like you're, going to a regular kind of float center experience.
Right.
I don't even actually know of any that are co-ops or anything like that either for their structure. And definitely if you do have a nonprofit or co-op float center out there, reach out and let us know because I'd be really curious to hear how that's going for you. That said, I like the idea.
Yeah.
I think it sounds cool.
It does sound cool.
And I've thought about, what it would take to turn Float On into a nonprofit or to open up our own crazy nonprofit float center as well. So it's definitely something that we're interested in.
Yeah, you'd have to do a little bit more work to make it happen in terms of like having a board and that sort of stuff. I think you typically don't often see things like that for running kind of a brick and mortar shop, probably for the reason of the shop has very logistical kind of day-to-day set needs, as opposed to a nonprofit where you're kind of really driving a certain mission and developing kind of plans to achieve those goals. But that's not to say that it can't work, that those structures are necessarily at odds with each other.
Yeah,
that's just my guess as to why it's not quite as common of a thing.
Yeah, I mean, and it is, so, another thing is you don't own it at that point, right? If it's a nonprofit, it serves the public. And its goal is to fulfill some kind of mission that benefits the people who the nonprofit is stated to benefit, whoever that is, some form of the public usually, right? Mm-hmm. And as a result, you end up with a board who's kind of in charge of the overall guidance of the nonprofit. And then often you have a totally separate team who's running, in this case for the float center, the operations and management of the facility itself. And sometimes those two overlap. Often they're separate. The board doesn't really get paid. The operations side does. The board is in control, but can be voted out oftentimes by the other board members or by the constituency of the nonprofit, by the other members.
Yeah.
So there's this, again, there's kind of these structures in place, but the basic concept is that through those structures, the nonprofit is sort of self-contained. Although it has people who are serving it, it isn't really there as like a thing that's owned by those people. In that sense, you can't really sell a nonprofit. It doesn't become a saleable business in the same way. And you can't take, it's a nonprofit, so obviously you can't take profits from it. And if all you're doing is serving on the board and not on operations, you can't even really pay yourself as easily.
Usually, yeah.
There's ways to do it, but there's also some division between those roles that often happens. So again, as far as if you're going into it with the sense that you want to run your own float business and you want your float business to be a nonprofit, that might kind of be the wrong way to think about it. And if what you're thinking is that you want to set up this nonprofit float center that isn't really yours, that could just kind of run and, maybe eventually you go off and do your own thing, that's maybe a little better way to think about how a nonprofit might organize itself.
Mm-hmm. But there are a lot of like you hear of some like more wellness places, massage, acupuncture, or like bigger places that have facilities operating as co-ops.
Yeah.
Sometimes. So that might be a slightly more well-worn path to look at.
Yeah, and that's where, a lot of your members, even a lot of your customers who aren't members, would end up being members of that co-op. So it's kind of like your float center is owned by the people who are floating in it, would be that way of going.
Connected with the community. I don't know, as a nonprofit, if you'd have to like make a case for floats being a charitable sort of thing, or if that would be any sort of roadblock that you'd hit.
It probably depends. I mean, so there's a 501c3, which is the charitable nonprofits.
Yeah, I mean, so you're not, that's probably what you'd be.
Probably. You could set up a church afloat.
Yeah, that's
whole
true.
different C designation. And then there's also, I guess, another side of this is not even on the nonprofit side. There's the not-for-profit as well, where you're set up as a regular for-profit business, essentially, but you're deciding that you're not going to take profits. You're essentially not paying dividends, and you're going to take those profits and do something with them. Usually you're donating it to a cause, or sometimes you're reinvesting in your own mission. But essentially it just means that the owners of the business aren't taking the profits from the business themselves and putting it in their pockets or anything like that.
Yeah, and there's all sorts of different shades of business structures here that might seem appealing to people. There's B Corps, which are kind of a newer thing, which not every state has like fully ratified yet, but a lot have, and that's basically the idea that you are a for-profit business, but instead of your goal as a business only being to maximize profits, your goal also is to make sure that you're being environmentally friendly and environmentally sustainable, and that you are supporting your kind of local community somehow. So it kind of, they call it like the triple bottom line. So instead of just focusing on money, you have these other goals, and your business can make decisions based on fulfilling those goals as well. So that's kind of a new business model that is, I think, a nice direction for business to go.
Yeah, definitely. And as a note too, if you start looking into this, what you'll find is that is actually sort of a layer that goes on top of your existing business. So a B company wouldn't be like instead of having an LLC or instead of having a C Corp, you have this B corporation or something like that.
Like a BC Corp, or my favorite, the BS Corp.
But yeah, it's this extra layer that basically just says you're allowed to not have your bottom line be just profit for your shareholders, which is a cool thing to add on, regardless if you're into that sort of thing,
Yeah, and there's all sorts of crazy. There's ESOPs we've looked into, which are businesses that are pretty much entirely owned by the employees. There's I've even heard of like a business structure that's based on blockchains like Bitcoin, and there's just stuff gets to get real wild kind of the deeper you want to go. But what we found is that it's kind of hard sometimes for a small business to really do some of this stuff. When you really look into like turning your business into one of these kind of alternate business structures, sometimes what you find at the end of that road is you need a lot of money to actually manage something like that, and with something the size of a float center, it's just financially not quite possible, or at least very easy to operate as some of these business structures. They're really meant for kind of larger operations.
Yeah, as you can imagine, kind of the more interesting, what am I trying to say here? Like the more interesting ways that you have to run your business, the more paperwork and the more things you need to make sure that those ways of running your business that are a little more alternative can actually get done, which means oftentimes the more oversight, the more legal contracts, the more meetings. And so you start getting into these fancy ways to give back to the community or even share in general, pretty much anything above just being a not-for-profit. And it gets really crazy. Like a lot of them don't make sense unless you're grossing $5 million a year as a business, right? And anything under that size of revenue, and you'd just be spending $40,000 simply on the maintenance of these structures. So it does unfortunately get a little hairy going into them.
But I think they're all awesome, and I love when people actually try to go for it. So if someone out there is doing cool stuff, definitely let us know. Send us a message.
Yeah, do it. It's all possible. I love it. Ashkahn loves it. Our podcast, as a person, if it were a person, loves it. All right, and hopefully that answered your question. Certainly the, if not, what do you think portion.
It's usually the portion we answer. All right, if you guys have other questions you want to ask us, hop over to floatanksolutions.com/podcast, and we'll talk to you tomorrow.
All right, bye everyone.